Welcome, everyone, to another installment of the Esoteric Wellness Blog. I am your host, Coach Kyle. So, what is on my mind today? I think today I wanted to talk about something that's got me really excited, and maybe not everyone's aware of it yet or getting hints and pieces of it, but how advancements in science, and specifically neuroscience, quantum physics, and some other areas are really leading us to a much different new understanding of things. And I feel that it's doing so in a way that's making me very, very hopeful for the future of humanity. And what I'm talking about is we'll start with neuroscience. Like, I used to be really fascinated with this concept of the mind body connection, for example. And modern neuroscience is telling us that there is no two separate things to connect. There's no separation between mind and body. So there's no connection. It's all one thing. While how we experience it might be kind of separate ideas, separate concepts, but we've really been able to discover and see how all of this really functions, how all of it really works down to the neuron level. And we've been able to identify all these pathways and what's talking to what and when. And we're really understanding now that there is no separation because there's no difference. And what this means is that because there's no separation and all this is connected in an extremely complex way, like I describe it like there's feedback loops within feedback loops within feedback loops, where you have all these different inputs and any one input affects all the others. Like, it's such a complex system, so much information flowing around. And what I'm getting at is, what happens in our mind, our conscious mind and our brain, it has direct, real, very physical effects in the body. And what happens in the body, vice versa, it has very real physical effects in the brain, which leads to very real conscious effects in our mind as far as how we're experiencing it. And this should be exciting because while it might feel at first like, wow, this is really, really complex, and that might make us feel like we have little to no control of any of it, which I totally understand how one could feel that way initially. But when you really start to think about it and work with it, what this means is we have an amazing level of control and influence in the whole system. Where, previously we've been thinking like the body's the body and the mind is the mind. Yeah, they're connected in some ways, but we can't really control what's going on in one with the other. But with this new understanding that everything's intimately tied together, intimately connected, there is no separation. We can directly influence what's happening in our bodies with our mind and vice versa. This gives us so much power and control and influence in the system because our conscious mind, which we have a lot of control over, can influence the whole system. And we can use that power in ways to basically direct the outcomes we want. And that's an amazing level of power and ability that we all have. We don't need a prescription for that. We don't need some fancy treatment or medication to be able to do this. We all have this ability. We might need some help in learning how to do it, but That's a power we all have. And that's amazing. But if that's true, if that's the case, why are so many people suffering? And I think there's a simple explanation for this, and that we've created a world, an environment in which we live that is not naturally conducive. It doesn't naturally lead to positive outcomes, outcomes where we have a high quality of life. And, that's a tragedy in its own right and a whole another issue that I'm not going to really dive into here. And I'm sure that there could be a setup, an environment in which we would just naturally end up in a much more positive place. I'm sure that's possible, and that should be something we're working towards. But even when we're in an environment that's not naturally guiding, influencing all this in that direction, we can still arrive there. We can still exist in that more positive outcome because we have this high level of control in that outcome. We have a say, but we have to recognize where our say lies and how we can use that. So, in the work I do with clients and working through chronic symptoms, is, you know, they've been led down that road to this negative outcome where they're living with these chronic symptoms of some kind that affect their quality of life in negative ways. And that's been primarily due to, again, not their fault, but the environment in which they live has kind of naturally guided the system in that direction. And what, in working with me, they're learning how to do is how to use their influence that they have direct control of to affect the system as a whole. So this isn't about like tricking our brain that we don't need to have this symptom or to be in pain or whatever. This is about wielding our influence in the system to nudge it in the direction we want things to go. So I often use the analogy, we've got a boulder rolling down a mountain and we want to change its direction. Well, if you try to just stop it in its tracks and stand in its way, it's just going to run you over. But if we were able to run alongside it and nudge it consistently in one direction, we could over time drastically change its trajectory. And that's essentially what we're doing. We don't have complete control of the system as a whole, but with consistent nudges and a consistent direction over time, we can vastly change it at the whole level. So, what are some actual examples of what the hell I'm talking about here? I think, for example, what comes to mind right away is a study looking at. So, what they did is they created two different milkshakes, or no, excuse me. They told two groups that there were two different milkshakes, and in reality, they're identical. They're same milkshake, no difference, exact same ingredients, exact same amounts. But they told one group, "Oh, this is a very indulgent, rich milkshake," right? And they told the other group, "Oh, this is a very healthy, low calorie milkshake." So they gave both groups this identical milkshake, and they took, they did a lot of blood work both before and after. And what they saw was just that difference in expectation and belief about the milkshake they were consuming led to drastically measurable differences in things like how much did their blood sugar increase? All these biological markers turned out to be quite different in each group when the nutrients of the milkshake they ingested were identical. There's another example of they took two groups of housekeepers in a hotel. And they explained to one group that the work they did was great physical exercise. and that it was great for their bodies. The other group, they didn't teach them anything new. They just business as usual. And in the group, they gave that different expectation to, that the work they did was exercise. They saw things like that group lost weight. That group saw improvements in other biomarkers like blood pressure, cholesterol, things like that. And nothing changed, just their belief and expectation around it. And this is known as placebo effect. But the placebo effect is pretty darn powerful and quite amazing when you stop and think about it. Like, just by having a different belief and expectation about the outcome, we get a different outcome. This is like magic. And, the level of influence this can have in the body, down to individual neurotransmitters in the brain, all these real physical changes that it can drive, it can affect in the body. It's just like mind blowing. I think this is the best example of what I'm talking about. It's something we've known about for a very, very long time. We're just now beginning to really thoroughly understand how that's happening. What pathways in the brain and nervous system is this information traveling through? We're just now gaining that level of understanding. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating. It used to be just kind of this annoying thing we had to deal with. It was almost like magic. We didn't really understand why or how. We just saw the effect of it. But the amazing thing to consider is that placebo or nocebo, we can direct things in a non-positive way just as easily. It's always there. It's always happening with everything, every aspect of our lives. So if you could train yourself, if you could learn how to use that in a helpful direction all the time, what difference would that make in your life? How different would you feel? And I would argue pretty damn different. And ultimately, that's a lot of what this process is learning how to use that effect we have with our mind in a consistently positive way, and learning to recognize where we're not doing that and work to change it. So where am I catastrophizing? Where am I building myself up with negative expectation? Where am I, shooting myself in the foot in some ways? And what can I do to effectively learn a different way to do that in a way that's going to help me achieve a more positive outcome? On top of this, there's also like developments in quantum physics, for example, that are super interesting and really amazing to stop and think about. Like, for example, like 99.9999% of your physical body is nothing. It's empty space. I mean, look at the structure of an atom. It's a nucleus of protons and neutrons surrounded by electrons. But most of that atom atomic structure is empty. The space between electrons and the nucleus, and even in the nucleus, there's space in between the protons and neutrons. And you could zoom in even further within those particles, and there's empty space in there too. And nothing is truly touching, right? So neighboring atoms in your skin are not physically touching. It's all held together and held separate from forces like electromagnetic forces, nuclear forces, and so on. So what does this mean? This means that we are 99.9999% energy. We're energy. It's simply what you can take from that, because all that's held together with energy. So we're energy. And that opens up some interesting concepts, interesting ideas, because energy is formless. Energy isn't bound to a physical boundary or structure. And even when you stop and look at, what we consider as a physical boundary of our physical body, our skin, it's interacting with atoms in the air and exchanging atoms, and we're always shedding atoms and gaining new ones. I mean, where do we really start and end? And if you factor in like our microbiome, just all these little microorganisms living on our skin, in our body, in our gut, especially when you consider a lot of that microbiome is we would die without it. It's critical. Like it has to be there for us to survive. There are certain amino acids and enzymes that are created by the microbiome in our gut, for example, that our body cannot create. So again, where do we start? Where does the rest of the universe begin? It's getting a little muddy now. If you take out what we would consider a non-human cell, but it leads to the death of the human being, is it part of the human? Curious to think about. And there's some other interesting areas of science happening right now, like biofield research, for example, looking at the field of energy around our bodies. For example, what we can measure, like our heart emits a field of EMF radiation, electromagnetic radiation around us, and about 6 feet in either direction. So we're directly influencing the area around us with this electromagnetic radiation from our heart. What effect does that have on people within our immediate vicinity? What effect are they having on us? Interesting questions. Our bodies emit light that we can't see with our eyes, but we're emitting light. Every living thing emits some form of light. Is that a form of communication? Are we picking up on that? We don't know. These are interesting questions. But the point I'm getting at is this is where modern science is meeting up, and this is what gets me excited. But this is where modern science is starting to meet up again with these very ancient esoteric ideas that, like, there is no separation between any of us. We're all connected. We're all one with each other. We're all connected with the universe. And we're starting to see that, wow, that's really true. You can't draw a line of separation between where I end and you begin, especially when we're in close vicinity to each other. And it makes me think of like studies that have been done looking at like how a doctor patient relationship affects patient outcomes. So when a patient has a positive relationship with their doctor, when they feel safe, they feel heard, they feel valued by their doctor, they get better quicker. They can reach higher levels of health versus if they had a relationship with their doctor where they don't feel those, where they feel the opposite. Like, how's that happening? Sure, there's placebo because that's creating thoughts and emotions in the individual and the patient. But is there also some level of interaction at an energetic level? We don't know. That has yet to be studied. That has yet to be confirmed. But we're learning enough to be able to pose the question. So, anyway, I'm not sure where I'm going with all this, but this is the kind of stuff that gets me excited, that gets me hopeful for the future, that we'll continue to learn more and be able to apply what we learn in helpful ways. But I think what I can tell you for sure is that we have the power to greatly affect our own health, our own well-being, our own quality of life in profound, profound ways through just gaining better control through practice of how we think, how we feel, how we relate to what's happening in our life, or our own suffering, our own misery, when it arises, that we can consciously create the experience we want to have. This is ultimately such a huge, huge understanding to gain. We're in so much control of our own experience. It doesn't matter what's going on around us. Yeah, we can't control what happens to us in external events from external influences, but we can always control the experience we have with that. Now, this isn't like flipping a switch and we suddenly can do all this. It takes practice, it takes effort consistently over time, but we can learn to be able to do this. And nobody's perfect. We can't yet to meet somebody who can do this consistently all the time. But that's what we're here for, to practice, right? And to get a little better each day. So if you listen to this whole ramble, um, thank you. I hope you found it interesting and useful in some way. And I look forward to the next one. You are beautiful. You are loved. Until next time.